Good afternoon, everybody. This is Matt Kinsman, Head of Content at SIIA's Connectiv division. Thanks again for joining us today for Finding Hidden Revenue with Existing Content. Content marketing is a core part of today's marketing services pitch, and we see information providers launching dedicated content studios or content labs all the time now. One of the most recent being North Star Travel Group's launch of its Studio 90 team to handle new projects. But not everyone has the resources to create a dedicated group, and even if you do, there's a lot of potential in leveraging existing content that's already been published as a revenue generator and as a lead gen vehicle. Today we're happy to have David Fortino, Senior Vice President of Audience and Product at Netline, talk about how you can take existing content and turn it into a moneymaker and a lead gen vehicle. David, please take it away.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate having the opportunity to speak here. It's, amazingly, I think the last time we have kind of unpacked this idea was back at the Connectiv CEO Summit. And so a lot's transpired in the space since then, both specifically with publishers on the platform, but also our footprint in the space as well. And so I think the goal of this session today is really focused on a few kind of key pillars as takeaways. I'm hoping the session is really brief and understanding of your time, but also is a mixture of, unfortunately, some PowerPoint slides, but then also a live experience to kind of unpack exactly how this all works versus it just sticking to theoretical and a lot of marketing BS. So the 4 bullets in front of you today are what you should be walking out of this session understanding, which is how you can turn existing content, typically it's gated content, into an instant and always on 30% increase in revenue associated to that content. Doing so without actually establishing ad units around it or paywalls or any derivative of the sort. Enhancing operational efficiencies or inefficiencies that you already have. And then selling with confidence, and we'll get to that towards the end. But when you're talking about lead gen, one of the things that always causes concern is how accurate the data could be that's being delivered to a client, but more importantly, what kind of scale and controls do you have over that data so that you can project accurately for your customers? Those key pillars were really built upon observations that over the past 2 years we've been really studying when it related to content monetization obstacles, and specifically trying to understand monetization associated to gated content. So it doesn't necessarily have to be lead gen oriented content, but it could be a webinar, it could be a podcast, it could be even something as simplistic as a newsletter opt-in, or perhaps even maybe some kind of attribute of a specific ebook, an anchor asset that's trying to acquire net new users from your own audience base. And so one commonality that we've experienced time and time again is that publishers' inherent technology stack as it relates to data capture tends to be somewhat conservative and arguably a bit primitive. And so if you're looking across the marketing landscape in 2018 and going into 2019, I think anyone who's paying attention knows that there are literally, I believe right now, over 7,000 vendors delivering technology to publishers and marketers in this space. Selecting the right plug-and-play solutions that make sense for not only your business but also for your customers is really of utmost importance, because if you're doing that wrong, you're typically just getting tools which are otherwise extremely powerful, but they turn into toys because you ultimately really don't have any practical adaptations or understanding how to extract the most value from them. And so what you're seeing here on the left side is a screenshot of a typical publisher-oriented form. I would call this somewhat of a static form. Inherently, there are a number of issues related to direct and indirect monetization that typically get swept under the rug. But before even getting into monetization, there's a lot of just processes behind the scenes that are associated to building one of these things. And so typically, a publisher actually has to have a developer build it, so there's HTML code being used. And in some cases, if there's not HTML being touched, they're using some third-party SaaS solution that they're actually paying to use. There tends to be zero predictive capabilities. And what I mean by that is that if a person, let's say, is typing in a free-form job title and they said that they are an accounting manager, the job title theoretically should map to manager. The functional area should be finance. That's a smart adaptation of simple predictive capabilities. ABM is something that everyone has fallen in love with through and through on the industry, but most forums negate, which would be an example of perhaps I typed in david@tesla.com. It should theoretically know my company name, my company size, my industry, where that company's at as well. Lacking zero social capabilities to sign in, so common implementation use cases would probably be a LinkedIn login there. And when I say responsive-ish, this is an example of a form that, although is responsive, it also has a scroll, which you're not seeing down here, which is a horizontal scroll. And then this unit actually here is a scroll within a mobile device. So it's not terribly conducive to driving conversions. And lastly, a lot of publishers struggle with just simply securing their data. And so when it came time to look at that, and most importantly, adapt a revenue model on top of things, we started looking at it just from a technological stance first, and then tried to understand the market footprint and assign economics to it. And so what you're seeing here is a machine-built derivative of the prior form I showed you that actually no HTML has ever been touched. It makes fully extensive use of predictive data sets, ABM-driven data sets. It has an artificial intelligence-powered incremental revenue system, which down here is called Audience Target. It's basically a content recommendation algorithm that is dynamically understanding exactly who the user is that's going through the form, and I'll show you a live example in a moment, where they work, the company size, perhaps even the company itself if it's an ABM campaign, and tries to match that user in a sub-millisecond basis to over 8,000 other additional assets that are being hosted on the platform. By doing so, the user, instead of just requesting the content here and that lead being sent back to the publisher and also the publisher's client, that data is also going to potentially this company, Sysomos, whose white paper is here. But because of that's happening, the publisher participating in the program is getting a revenue share on top of that. So typically that's where you're getting like your 30% boost of incremental revenue simply by just doing what you're already doing, right? You had a gated form, you're replacing it with a new gated form. The only delta there is that you've got monetization directly as part of that process, while the other one you don't. Getting back to missing components, this obviously did pull in a LinkedIn login, which will pre-fill the form based upon whatever LinkedIn has on your profile. Field level data validation. This is a big one. A lot of times when we look at static forms that are being used in the landscape, they tend to truly be that. Data is being captured, it's being fulfilled into an Excel doc, nothing more. There's really no data qualification, no strategic kind of vision or approach to vetting data on the fly. All of those things should be considered, especially when the product that you're delivering to your client is data. Fully responsive and obviously secure, and GDPR and CASL and so on compliant. So instead of just running through what things look like and what publishers can do, what I'd like to do now is unpack some facts that have happened since the Connectiv CEO Summit, which was earlier this year. These are really the core value props for anyone understanding how to monetize their audience through gated content. And so publishers on the platform have consistently been earning a 30% increase in bump of whatever they were actually earning from their own clients directly. So knowing your own business, you can model that extremely easily. There's now over 100 publications live on the platform that continues to accelerate dramatically, and we expect to have one really sizable publisher be launching before the end of the month, and we'll be happy to share with you guys. Those publishers have launched 1,500 campaigns by using the platform. And what I mean by campaign is simply they've replicated those old static forms on our technology, which allows for instant monetization. So those 1,500 forms were processing a ton of leads, and so this is getting to this. They've captured over 1 million plus content-centric leads from their owned and operated audiences. They've done that using the forms that are being powered by us, and as a byproduct have received a 30% bump in incremental earnings off of those versus what they were getting in the past, which was nothing on top of their existing solution. This is a nice process-oriented benefit and one that we quite honestly didn't expect. We knew it would be faster, but most publishers are seeing about a 90% faster to launch a campaign window. And so the reason behind that is simply coming down to the fact that there's less people involved, there's less QA, there's less back and forth with customers. It's all through a self-service interface, which I'll show you in a moment. So when we get to showing you in a moment, there's a number of things that I'd like to share with you here. And rather than kind of stick in the theoretical of the PowerPoint, what we'll do is jump over to the web. We'll show an active live publisher example. And then from there, I'll actually take you into the tool and show you how easy all of this is. And I think one key takeaway aside from instant monetization is that this shouldn't be difficult. And we commonly internally talk about this as the fact that we are democratizing lead gen. Publishers shouldn't have to have a massive infrastructure to do this. They shouldn't have a massive amount of costs associated to it. They shouldn't need a massive amount of personnel and overhead to do it, quite honestly. Content creation and audience creation, all of those things are really in the wheelhouse of a traditional publisher. Technology doesn't have to be. And arguably, there's only ever been two models in the past, which is a publisher invests directly to build their own technology, which is difficult, but I commend anyone who does that. The flip side is that you're simply licensing someone else's technology. There's perks of quick acceleration, but the downside is that you're somewhat married to that. We've theoretically created a third model, which is that it's a completely free platform for publishers to leverage. And as you use it, you're being compensated to use it. And so you no longer have to have basically associate a cost to that platform. It's very much turning into a profit center. And so getting back to a live example, we are at ALM's property called Think Advisor. And so there's a number of native units which are featuring their own clients' assets that have been set up on their site using our platform. But I know a shortcut is just going up here and going to the resource center. And so I would imagine virtually every publisher sitting in on the webinar, and those that aren't, who listen to this later, surely have a resource center of their own. It'll be featuring ebooks and white papers and webinars and case studies and perhaps analyst reports, tech docs, you name it. Conceptually, it's all the same, right? This content goes in here. It's a way to capture audience data, some of which is used for your own purposes from a marketing and or remarketing perspective. Some of it's used as a way to drive back value to your own customers, which would most likely align with the lead gen-based strategy. And other times it's probably both. And so what you're seeing here is their resource library. It's full of all of their own clients' assets. All of this content's been set up on our platform, and it dynamically feeds itself into this site. So when you're talking about process improvements right there, typically what would happen if you weren't using a platform built around automation is that this section here would need to be manually updated as a new campaign come aboard. And that becomes a problem because then you've got to basically kind of footprint and dialogue an exact process that everyone needs to follow at all times versus just allowing it to run on autopilot. And so what I'll do here as a user is click on one of these assets, and you'll see that you're taken to a form that's fully white labeled like their site. It gives that social capability if you'd like to use it, but for this purpose, I'm going to go in here and just simply say we'll say I'm David at Tesla, which I think is the example I mentioned earlier. I'm going to download. And so right now, what it did was it understood a number of things, and it also even recognized that this hasn't been used in 115 days. So that's prompting users to update their profile too. But what's interesting is behind the scenes, this form dynamically understood let me see if I can edit this actually. Dynamically understood where I worked, the company size I was at, the industry I was working at, and so on. And simultaneously then said, okay, well, what other things do we need to know about this user because this user was recognized? These are questions that Edward Jones wants to learn of this specific user. But simultaneously, these are other companies who are actively trying to reach, and I'm going to try to back into this one, saying that I'm a finance person working at a company in the automotive industry, which happens to have 10,000 plus employees located in the United States. And perhaps I'm manager and above at that company that has an annualized revenues of X. And forgive me, I don't know Tesla's annual revenues. And so right now, it took that user flow and said, okay, these are the exact assets that this specific user is relevant to receive, but more importantly, these companies are looking to educate that user on. And so if I, as a user, selected this one, I now getting this Edward Jones asset, but I'm also getting this one. What simultaneously has happened is that ALM is collecting revenue from their own client, which we have nothing to do with. And then ALM is also receiving compensation from us, which is part of the revenue that we're generating from this specific campaign. And so I'll try to manipulate this too, and we'll reset and say I'm David at, we'll do Hilton. And so here's an example of predictive data being used where it said, okay, I don't know David at Hilton because it didn't welcome me back. The first name and last name is still empty. And now you'll notice that there's no additional content being injected down there. But you are seeing that Hilton.com was understood and predictively mapped to Hilton Worldwide Holdings Incorporated with a U.S. headquarters, with an industry, a sub-industry, an annualized revenue, and also the employee count. But being that it still didn't know anything about me in this theoretical use case, I'm going to call myself Dave Test, and I'm going to say I'm the manager of marketing. Now I'm going to toggle off of this in a second. Right now you're not seeing anything. Toggle, now it added it over there. And what you'll see are offers over here that are trying to reach specifically me. And so again, active, real-time, AI-powered content recommendations to lead to direct monetized results. The beauty there is that you don't have to do anything. The users are actually driving that behavior. You just simply sit back and promote your content as you were, and you're generating net new revenue that otherwise just simply wouldn't happen. And so when you're looking at things like this, I'm assuming one of the questions that comes to mind, and we'll probably get to some questions later in the presentation, is how do you control what data goes to your customer? How do you impose filters and fulfillment and all of that? So what I'm going to do is jump back first into the actual product itself. And so I'll show you briefly here where we can go and actually hit login. And this is where publishers actually build campaigns. And so if I'm launching a new lead gen campaign, even if it's for my own content that I'm promoting in my own newsletter or social feed, I can just go in here and hit New Direct Campaign. Those are always free. They're super simple to launch. Typically, you can launch them in the time it takes to sip a cup of coffee. Prior to the session this morning, I actually mocked one up. And so theoretically, I went forward with the idea that Connectiv was using the platform to drive attendees for this very webinar. So what I did was I added the logo. I went and uploaded content. And so I created a little preview here. All of this happens without anyone touching any code. So I'll show you how in a moment. But here's our webinar, which is happening right now. Custom cover graphic was created too. And so adding content is this simple. Typically, if there's nothing here, it's a new campaign, you'd hit add content. But from here, being that it's already here, you can see title, tagline, abstract, the language that the content's in, the format of the content, there's a ton. And then this was a live webinar, so I told it that as well. But I think that's all well and good in terms of how easy it is. It creates a splash page. It creates a form dynamically on the fly. But that's not really all that valuable. It's our core value and your core value to your clients is very much about filter data sets and delivering explicitly leads to your clients that are not only engaged with their content, but have met core criteria that they've defined. And so this is where you get into step 4, and then we'll jump back out of here. This is what allows you to really control the flow of data from content engagement through to your client. Perhaps they don't want to actually engage with an engineer who is particularly interested in a spec sheet that's been published. And so you can actually go in and by job level and by job area and by industry, decide what you want to filter on. And by filtering on those values, you can control exactly who gets sent to your customer and who doesn't. And so if I'm looking at industry, that can even go into sub-industry filtering and so on. Again, because this is being applied to a campaign that's running direct to your own audience, you never pay for any of this. It's completely free. You can even layer an ABM campaign on top of that. Ultimately, what's really nice too is that as the campaign's running, you start capturing data. And most publishers' kind of client-facing reporting structure, in my experience, has been not much more than an Excel doc. And this is an area that, again, at no cost, provides a ton of value to publishers and allows them to look incredibly innovative in the space. And so simply by going into here, you go into the Reports tab, you find the report that you want to share with your client, You find the share column, you hit get link. I'm going to copy this link. I'm going to drop this up here in my browser. And what you will see is a Connectiv branded version of the report, down to their logo, their footer. It's got their postal address, contact information, even their tagline. And so this is a live view into a campaign that your client could actually engage on and perhaps even engage on with your salespeople and or client services reps. Even a content marketer might find this interesting, where it's looking at campaign performance and resonance, and it's saying of all of the good leads that met the campaign criteria, this is how they broke down by company size, by industry, and so on. Same users, but this is at it from the person level data perspective. So what are the job areas and job levels, job functions, the country? In this case, it was a US only campaign, so the states. And you can score the leads, so typically it's not always a perfect 4, as much as we would love it to be. Content summary. If a campaign has more than one asset, you can see how they perform against one another. If there's more than one content type, there can be infinite. You'll see how those things stack out against each other there as well. Analysis, to me, is probably the sexiest part of the reporting structure, in that you can do some fun stuff. So you can go in here and generate heat maps based upon, again, the users who've really engaged with your client's content and met their qualification criteria and said, wow, okay, managers and C-suite seemingly were kind of the key points of resonance there, but let's go with C-suite. And then at the exec level, well, their industry, oddly enough, it looks like most were in finance and then manufacturing. So let's go there. And then from a company size, there were 54 people that worked at a company of 250 to 500 employees. So I can just jump in and look at, typically this would be non-obfuscated data of the actual raw leads that have been generated for this campaign. It's all instantaneous access. Leads by date, self-explanatory. It's just showing a acceleration of the campaign. Impressions. This is kind of important in that most publishers never really talk about this with their clients, and that in order to syndicate content and generate leads, content has to be shown, theoretically. If you're not providing insights into impressions, I would imagine your clients are asking about where this content was shown, how much exposure did it receive. This allows you to kind of easily do that. And then lastly, the lead details tab is all of the leads that are associated to this campaign. And so there are a number of other benefits outside of just the branding of the reports, and you can do all kinds of configuration of filters on what the data is being presented. I think a lot of field level marketers and content marketers love this because they get to dig in and really understand content narratives, and it gives them ideas about campaign performance, but also what they could do next time around to perhaps have new content narratives. So what I'll do now is let's jump back to the PowerPoint, and we'll advance to what happens that you get into a situation whereby you've built all of these campaigns. You're now effectively monetizing your own audience extremely well. You've taken old static forms, converted them into dynamic forms with AI-powered content recommendations, and you're generating revenue every month seamlessly. But there comes to be a point at the end of a given month, at the end of a given quarter, that you have clients that are barking demands that are simply too large for you to meet. And so that could have been that you overbid on a proposal. It could have simply been that you underperformed on a campaign that you otherwise thought was going to perform well. What we've done is built into the product a safety net. And what the safety net allows you to do is have access to the entire suite of the product beyond the free part, which is that when and if you have the need, you can tap into 125 million unique professionals as they're actively consuming B2B gated content throughout the web. That site experience that I shared with you and us recommending additional content is done countless times around the web across 15,000 plus B2B specific properties. And we're processing typically over 800,000 gated leads per month. So in terms of scale and your ability to kind of instant access on-demand scale, it's effortless. And I can show you that in a moment, how simple that is. But quite simply, when you're in the interface and I showed you how to build a direct campaign, it's no different than simply clicking on a button saying convert. When you hit convert, you add a budget, and then you're on your way. We've found most publishers are amplifying their direct campaigns around 20% of the time. The rest of the time, they're always using the free product to monetize their audience. And so when we're talking about on-demand scale, these are some of the metrics I had just riffed off: about 125 million uniques, 700 to 800,000 gated assets being processed per month. But what's really important there, this comes down to our business model, and that it's very much a portfolio-based play spread across thousands of properties, is that 80% of the data that we're delivering to clients and publishers is net new to them. It's the opposite of a destination-based play. We've talked about filters, and I showed you briefly, but it's really important to kind of reinforce the capabilities there, because data isn't really valuable and can't be turned into information for yourself or for your client if it's not controlled tightly. It's imperative upon publishers and clients to really have an alignment up front as to who they're trying to reach with their content. Does that content actually even speak to the person in the appropriate voice? And if so, let's impose filters that mandate that only people that meet specific criteria ultimately get delivered to that customer. You might be thinking about, okay, this is phenomenal. There's a ton of data being captured. That's great. And now we've effectively monetized that content, and we've found ways to report elegantly to it. How do we get it to our clients? And so this is another free feature as part of the product. We offer real-time connectors into every marketing automation system known to man. If it's something that we haven't heard of, we will certainly investigate that and add it. But realistically, the most popular ones tend to be Eloqua, HubSpot, Marketo, Salesforce, integrate periodically. So it just depends. But I think the key takeaway there is the flexibility to support any downstream connectivity of data. The win there is that if it's going back into the publisher itself, then that allows you to kind of augment your subscriber file and your member profiles with additional data and insights about what they're doing. And then if it's going to your client, that allows them to have instant remarketing capabilities and nurturing capabilities to ideally help them drive pipeline. And so using that amplified model, publishers over the past year have gone on to actually purchase from us 250,000 additional leads that they wouldn't have been able to generate. And so you could take that two ways. One, obviously there's a cost associated to that, and everybody's looking to optimize margins, lessen costs, and be more nimble and efficient business. The upside is that they've been able to recognize revenue that they were going to lose. And so when they were booking these invoices, and let's say they had to deliver 500 leads a month, and they were doing that consistently for 6 months, but then it starts getting to be the second part of the year, and their audience is exhausted, quite honestly. There's no more tricks to be pulled. They've tried social, they've tried their newsletters, they've tried even custom native stuff. Nothing's worked. And so this is a way, through a click in that same interface, add budget to that same campaign, launch it with controlled filters, and still meet the needs of their customers. And so it's been a phenomenal way to arbitrage and ideally even grow revenues associated to those accounts. So we're going to the part here where we're going to wrap up, and I'm about to turn it over to questions. The goal, although this is blocked out for an hour, I'm really all about trying to keep sessions to about 30 minutes so that I can make a good use of your time and not kill you in the process. I don't need any ears bleeding over there. So the key takeaways are pretty obvious in that if you're not tapping into this type of model, a publisher is missing a lot of things. The first is the most clear part, which is what I touched on straight out of the gate, which is the instant incremental revenue opportunity. The technology benefits and the real-time analytics, all of that stuff, I find that to be incredibly compelling. Now, some publishers are more advanced there, and that's okay. Others are not. Either way, that's an instantaneously on capability with zero dev work and zero cost. And so typically alone, that's a huge win there. The on-demand scale was something that we had just talked about. And lastly, enhanced operational efficiencies. I can't tell you how many publishers that have come onto the platform have recognized huge gains internally and have shifted teams' responsibilities based upon it. They've actually moved on to different product groups, different responsibilities, all for the sake of really not working on what we would most likely consider to be a lot of busy work. And lastly, most importantly, all of this is done at no cost. And so aside from the on-demand scale part, which makes sense. You're making a massive step forward in not only your monetization efforts, but operationally and from a product perspective, modernizing the footprint of your capabilities to your customers. And so at that point, I'm going to wrap up right now and turn this back to Matt, see if he has any questions, if there's been any questions or comments solicited from the crowd, and we'll go from there.
All right, David, thank you. Folks, at this point, you can submit questions two ways. One, you can unmute your line by hitting *7 and asking your question over the phone. You can also type in your question in the lower left-hand corner. You can see the Q&A tab. Just type in your question and select Send to All Presenters, and we can address your question directly. David, you had talked about how some of your clients have really been shifting team responsibilities. Who ultimately owns this now? Is this editorial? Is this audience development? Is this digital media? Is this a combination of all above?
That's a great question because there has been, regardless of the account, there has been consolidation of ownership, and that before that whole process was kind of a mutt, it seems like. Each time we would go into an account, there'd be multiple groups being involved. The final owner I've seen end up in a few different ways. One has been audience development, and I would say the caveat being they get involved because a lot of times it's focused on capturing data from their own audience. But when you start crossing over to client-centric campaign and reaching out beyond the boundaries of their own audience, then it tends to be a marketing ops or an ad ops person or a production person or team kind of running point on that. Because of the revenue implications, I've seen sales leadership try to get involved or product leadership because there's a way for them to associate an instant boost of revenue to whatever their KPIs that they're being measured against on a quarterly basis. So I wish there was a clear-cut answer to say, oh, yeah, this is exactly what happens every time, but every company has been a little bit different and unique.
All right, terrific. David, you've got a question that's come in. What is the revenue split for leads that we generate, and what is the cost to capture new leads?
Sure. So the revenue split is a 30% share to you. You're paid automatically each month. There's zero invoicing. We pay either via PayPal, mass pay, and or a check. And I think you can get just a direct deposit too. And then the cost per lead, if you're looking to amplify, the cool part about that is that you actually can look at what the cost would be. And so I'm going to jump out of my slide deck here real quick, and we'll go back to the interface for where we were building a campaign. And I'm going to copy link, close this, and then we'll go to campaigns, and we'll find that Connectiv one. And what I was talking to you earlier was that the Connectiv campaign we set up as direct. And so direct meant it was just going to run to Connectiv's own audience at no cost, and they do whatever they wish with that campaign. But if I'm converting this into a paid campaign, let's simulate that. Let's go over here and hit convert. And I'm going to say, we'll just call this convert to. Great. And so now what we're going to do is it's copying all the content, all the settings, the filter attributes, everything, the downstream connector into Marketo. All of that's being copied over into a net new campaign. So you'll see the logos there. When we get to the content section, the content's still there. It's all set up the way it was, so you don't have to do any of that stuff again. And you just skip to filters. And so when you're at filters, you can actually see exactly what market price would be. There's a live pricing calculator here. So you can go in here and say, I want to target a campaign focused on U.S. professionals who have the job area, let's say a finance, general execs, IT, HR, and so on. And then perhaps we want to filter out some of these sub-level roles too. You can do that. From there, I'd like their job level to be manager and above. Their industry, I'm agnostic. Let's say I could care less. Don't really care what industry they're working in. And the number of employees in their company. Let's run a campaign focused on reaching 100 plus employees. And so right here, by doing those filters, you're seeing explicitly that would be $26 per lead that engaged with the content, but most importantly, only met those criteria points. You can change all different types of stuff. You can filter based upon annualized revenue versus company size by headcount. If you layer ABM campaign, you'll actually be able to upload a target list, and we'll do a real-time match rate right here against known accounts and recognized accounts. And you'll also see that those filters that we just set for the industry and the company size went away. Because when you're dictating what company you're targeting, that means our system predictively already knows that, let's say it's Ford. Ford is a company of 50,000 plus employees, and it's a automotive industry company. Account suppression is another filter that you could layer, is that if you had a client or yourself, you didn't want leads from a competitor or a channel partner, you can actually filter against those. And then this last one, we as a company have a big philosophical difference of opinion on, which is the business-only email address filter, but a lot of clients and or publishers like it, so we enable that. And that simply means that you're capturing only people using business domains as their actual email address that they provide. So yeah, I think that answered your question, but if there's any follow-up specific to pricing, feel free to let me know.
Folks, if you have additional questions, you can type them in the Q&A tab in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, or hit *7 to unmute your line. David, you talked about the depth of metrics available through this. Can you give us a sense of what type of metrics that your clients are paying the most attention to, and is this changing at all?
Sure. So there's all of the normal metrics. So if we're looking at the actual product, and we go back to a report, and we'll even jump into this one. You know, the first thing that they're looking at is trying to understand how a campaign is scored. And so the one thing that you'll see on any campaign is when we are looking at the lead summary tab, what they did was actually go in here, and this campaign is just a demo one, so it's not doing it. But when you're in the portal, you can go into a campaign and actually decide what leads are most important to you. And when that means that they're important to you, what do you actually do with them that are different than anything else? And so by going into scoring, you'll see here that there's a bunch of choices, but the only things you can see are those that I've selected as the user. And so when I'm picking a job area or job level on the filter side, then that's what would be shown here. I can give weighting both in terms of the actual filter value, but then also the sub-values associated to what the users select. And so I theoretically could go in and say, a C-level person, I'm going to give a B. And it defies logic there, but I've heard a number of times from our clients about this, is that the C-suite generally doesn't react to phone calls or emails all that much. So although the sales reps love seeing them, it becomes increasingly frustrated that they're not getting a response. But EVPs, senior VPs, we'll leave those as A's, and perhaps directors are B's, and so on. And then you can go through the entire matrix of the campaign and say, perhaps the advertising and marketing industry is a C. But there's one segment within that industry that's huge for us, and that's perhaps PR firms. I'm going to give those an A. And so what the net of this is that at the end of it, you're going to get individual leads being scored based upon what you decided was the most important. How you use that data depends on every company's setup. So publishers might use that data as insights into how to kind of further refine their own direct content narratives to them. If it's the end user who's receiving, or the end customer who's receiving this data as part of a lead gen campaign, they might be using it as a way to not only score but escalate leads into the sales org versus a marketing funnel. A lot of times, because these leads are being fulfilled real time, and I'll show you that, being fulfilled real time downstream into some marketing automation system via here, what happens is that they're automatically getting into an entry point of a nurture path, and then at that point, they still need to have some values associated to them to score out and ultimately over to the sales org. But marketers who are using this and/or publishers can actually skip that step and say, well, if they've already exhibited this type of behavior and show these values associated to who they are, those are really our sweet spots. So let's escalate those leads differently. Let's treat them differently. Let's get them to actually our enterprise sales team versus going into a BDR group, whatever it might be. So there's the one side. I think the other side very much gets down into when you're looking at the report, this tab specifically, the analysis tab, allows a content marketer to really start doing some cool thinking, which is that you can really start understanding, let's remove this, and I'll go to job area and move job level over here and get rid of job area. And so what you're seeing here is we've got C-suite, finance job area, certain company sizes, 66. And so what we can start to do is think about why certain users or audience groups gravitated to specific assets. And by doing that, you can understand whether you wanted them to do that in the first place or not. If you don't want them to do that in the future, then that's a way to deploy additional filters so that they're not engaging with your content. Conversely, you could go into this and say, wow, we were completely blown away here that there were, 26 people working at the utility and energy space at companies of 100 to 250 employees. And so we have no content that speaks to that specific audience. So a content marketer would say, well, that's phenomenal activity, that just organically happened. So why not, let's think about creating a campaign down the road that actually has content that directly speaks to those needs and not just kind of go forward in this generalized fashion any longer. Let's speak to people in the tone and voice that they expect to receive it in versus it just being bucketed into a global or a generic campaign. So I would say that those are really the two sides. One's more the content optimization and understanding, and then the other side is very much related to pipeline.
All right, thank you. Folks, we are winding down. This is the last call for questions, so please type them in the left-hand corner or unmute your line by hitting *7. David, I'm just wondering if you can leave us with any best practices that you've seen your clients adapt after starting to work with Netline. Changes to their websites, changes to their forums, changes to their gated content. What seems to be some best practices coming out of this relationship?
Well, the barrier of least resistance, quite honestly, is that every publisher typically has a library of gated content now. We've been helping publishers migrate all of that content over to our forums at no cost, and even doing it for them in some cases just to accelerate the adoption. The simple byproduct is that as soon as those forums go live on their site and they're no longer linking to their own forums, they're generating more revenue than they ever had. And so the beauty there is quite simply obvious, right? And I know I've said it probably a dozen times at this point, but by not doing this, you're intentionally leaving revenue on the table, and it's probably the easiest cash to be had. If you go on to spend money with us on the amplified side, that's phenomenal. That's obviously part of our business model's design, is that we know publishers who are running our technology will 20 to 30% of the time need amplification help, and we're here to be that help whenever they need it. But we also know that we can't force those situations. We don't even have insights into those situations when you're struggling or when you're not. And so getting that baseline foundation of you running on our platform for all of your gated content needs, whether it's a webinar, an ebook, or so on, is something that just allows that need on the safety net side for instant amplification just to happen whenever you need it. And there's no negotiations, there's no phone calls, there's no features that need to be turned on or anything like that. It's all there. I think the only other major benefit that they could recognize straight out of the gate is that it's instantaneously a unified login across their entire experience as well. So being that most publishers are having or operating brands across very different lines of business, different topics and industries, the technology is globalized not only across that publisher account, but the entire web. And so if a user has ever engaged with content through any publisher on our platform, if your audience is one of those users, we'll recognize that user via cookie. If their cookie's cleared, they can actually type in their email address. And as you saw for that one example, it said, oh, it's been 191 days since you've been here. Can you please review your information and make sure it's still accurate? And so there's a lot of kind of intelligence behind the scenes that are really focused on trying to drive not only a good experience for clients and the end user, but an experience that's conducive to increasing conversions. And so the more that we can use predictive and the more that we can actually pre-fill data into forms and compress forms, conversion rates dramatically go up versus the static form example that I shared with you earlier on that most publishers are using. And obviously, when conversions are going up, that means revenue is going up in process.
All right, excellent. David, thanks very much. Folks, this concludes the webinar. I will be following up shortly with an archive of both the presentation and the visual recording. I'd like to thank David Fortino of Netline for speaking with us today. Thank you guys for tuning in today, and we will talk shortly. Take care.
Thank you.